Welcome to PwC's What's Next in Cyber podcast series. I'm Sloan Minkus, a principal in our cybersecurity, privacy, and forensics practice, and I'll be your moderator for today's episode. We'll be gathering some real-time feedback from our guest on privacy and behavior. Joining me remotely is Alessandro Acquisti, a professor of information technology and public policy at the Heinz College, Carnegie Mellon University. Welcome, Alessandro.
Hello, Sloan. Pleasure to be here with you.
I'd like to start by asking you to elaborate on how people view the concepts of their privacy and the use of cybersecurity and what makes people feel the way that they do.
I can start by quoting an American social psychologist, Irwin Altman. He wrote a lot about privacy in the 1970s. His work is still very applicable today. He talked about privacy as a phenomenon which is culturally specific and culturally universal, meaning changes to the perceptions and the way we construe privacy change dramatically even from culture to culture, but the concept itself seems to be universal to different cultures. That can be said also for individuals. Across individuals, there are very different notions of privacy. For some people, privacy is about just data. For others, it's about autonomy or dignity or freedom. For others, it's about protection from the creepy influence of surveillance or targeted ads. But across different individuals, you still find this common trait that we all try to carve out these boundaries between public and private. Of course, each of us has different sensitivities regarding those boundaries. Some people are more open, some people are more private. But what is universal is this need and drive for a private space, as much as there is in each of us a need and a drive for socializing, interacting, and communing with others.
Are there any nudging interventions that come to mind when considering ways to change the way people view those concepts of privacy and protecting personal data?
Sure. So, as a matter of fact, the research coming from my group, I was hinting at earlier, research on behavioral hurdles, the challenges that individuals face in protecting privacy online, directly ties to the research on nudging, because essentially nudges are forms of architecture of choice modifications which aim precisely at helping people overcome or counter or address those behavioral hurdles, cognitive and behavioral biases. So that's by and large what nudging or soft paternalism is about. Now, there are typologies of nudges. There are categories of nudges. Essentially, anything that can modify behavior without imposing one specific route of action and without altering the cost-benefit balance. For instance, increasing price is not necessarily an example of a nudge because that's an actual change in the monetary trade-offs associated with an action. But example of nudges which instead meet the criteria I just mentioned range from informational intervention or providing more information to individuals about the, for instance, in the case of privacy, about the consequences of information disclosure. Usability nudges. We cannot just throw more and more information to individuals because if we just send information without context or if we provide too much information, a natural reaction is information avoidance. So we try actually to be selective in terms of what information we highlight to individuals, and we try to make individual choice more usable, easier. We try to make it easier for individuals to implement the choice they remind. The way we present things, the way we present options. This is a double-edged sword, by the way, because organizations can present options in a certain way by leveraging default settings or using gray out user interfaces, while some others are more visible and more salient. They can nudge in this way individuals towards outcomes which are more desirable and more desired by the organization itself. And this is what has come to be known as a dark pattern, but they can also be used instead by or for the individuals, the same strategies, altering the order in which options are presented, highlighting one rather than the other, can instead be used by individuals or for individuals to nudge them towards behaviors or outcomes which are supposed to be more beneficial to them. To give you some specific examples related to research we have been conducted recently, this is not purely about privacy. This is the overlap between privacy and information security, because the following example relates to secure payments, secure online payments. In a recent study, an experiment in fact, we investigated whether we could nudge end users towards adopting secure mobile payments. We all know that credit cards are very useful, but they are not exceptionally secure. There is a vast dark market trade in stolen credit card numbers. There are some technological solutions that can make your usage of credit cards more secure, but not many people are aware of those better approaches. So we try to use two particular styles of intervention, what we may call nudges. One was protection motivation theory, the other was implementation intentions. Under protection motivation theory, you explain to people what are the potential dangers, for instance, associated with the action they are conducting right now, and what are the potential benefits associated with alternative strategies. So you inform them about the existence of an alternative, but you also explain why, and you motivate them towards using the potential alternatives. And in terms of implementation intentions, instead, you try to make the individuals commit to some change, some behavioral change. For instance, you ask individuals to write down a plan of action in which by next week they will start using a new payment system, and they will test it at least once. And we found that both protection motivation theory grounded interventions and implementation intentions grounded interventions were in fact effective in motivating and in leading people to try out more secure online mobile payment systems. So these suggest that there is some margin of utility in using nudges and these types of behavior interventions to help people make better privacy or security decisions.
So I just love that we're using the term nudges. It feels very positive, or that we're moving in a positive direction. I'm wondering, could you expand a bit on those nudging interventions, maybe the implementation intentions that you just mentioned, or the protection motivation theory that you tested recently or researched recently? Can they be implemented so that they could scale to a more broader audience?
Right, that's a key question, right? Because there is this bridge between demonstrating something in behavior experiments, as we do, then using it in the outside world, and the key challenge, in my view, is not whether the intervention works or doesn't work. That's an important issue, of course, but it's not, to me, the primary obstacle. The primary obstacle is which one is the entity which deploys the nudge. What I mean is the following. In some cases, there can be interventions which are entirely user-driven. It is the person himself or herself who starts using a nudge on himself or herself. Scholars also refer to this scenario with the term self-commitment devices. You may have heard about the alarm clock, which is a mobile alarm clock. It stays on the ground. It has little wheels, and when it goes off in the morning, unless you raise from your bed and you go there and you tap it, it keeps moving through the room and keeps buzzing. And that's a form of self-commitment, right? Because the moment you are waking up and you hear this alarm and you have to get up of bed, you probably hate that alarm clock. But the night before, you set it up because you were committing your own self to proper behavior the next morning. Okay. Other examples are making a public commitment to a certain cause, such as from next week I will start running 5 miles per week. And then also publicly committing to donating money to organizations you don't like if you renegade, if you fail on this public commitment. Now, we can do the same in privacy and security in certain cases, and there are indeed certain tools which are completely user-driven. The user is in charge, can decide to download them, implement them, and use them to self-commit themselves. One example is one set of examples, really, are these apps which people use to avoid distractions. There is an app, for instance, called Freedom that you can set and stops you from browsing YouTube or Facebook, etc., at given moments of your day. So you're self-committing yourself, and you can use it without any permission from Facebook or from Google, etc. However, in many cases, in many other scenarios, this kind of user-driven self-commitment doesn't work, because we actually need another entity to create the infrastructure for the nudging intervention for us. We cannot just autonomously nudge ourselves, because because the problem is more complex than that. For instance, imagine, again, to use simple examples, password meters, where it is the website that has to have the initiative to set up a password meter when you create an account with that particular service provider. If the site doesn't do it, you may completely forget about the importance of a strong password. So in this second case, where the nudging intervention is driven by a firm or an organization, the issue, the problem becomes a problem of economic incentives, meaning are the incentives of the user towards more privacy or towards more security collinear? Are they aligned with the economic incentives of the service provider? In some cases, yes. I would argue that in the case of information security, both the user and the provider of the system have strong incentives to motivate secure behavior, because no one benefits from data breaches except the attackers. But in the case of privacy, things get much more complex, much more nuanced. The individuals may perhaps have an interest in protecting certain data. The platform provider may have an incentive in inducing, nudging the individuals to provide more and more data. So we have a misalignment in incentives, which raises the issue of then how do you nudge? Because who would create the infrastructure for nudging? And this leaves the last possible option, which is the policymakers. In some cases, it is the policymakers who establish certain guidelines that private sector firms have to follow. Consider, for instance, the CCPA, the California Privacy Protection Act in California. It mandates, among other things, some granting of options to visitors or websites on whether the data collected by sites or those visitors can in fact be sold to third parties or not. And this information has to be provided to visitors when they arrive on the site. And as a matter of fact, a number of us, a CMU, mixed team of behavioral scholars and computer scientists, worked on which type of icons could best signal to visitors of a website that there was in fact a do not sell my data option. We went through a iterative process of testing and redesigning the icons, testing, redesigning, and we were extremely happy when eventually the state of California endorsed our own design and proposed it going forward for websites as a way to implement that particular provision of CCPA. So that's an example of policymakers entering the arena and trying to suggest what kind of tools should be used to help users' security or privacy behavior.
Great. So as I ask the last question here, let's have a little bit of fun and perhaps maybe ask you to be a bit of a futurist here. So 10 years from now, through the eyes of an average person, what do you think, or what do you think will people see as the state of privacy and how their information is secured?
We are at a interesting juncture, to say the least. We do face some radically different scenarios going forward. It's kind of exciting as a scholar to be living and seeing this and just observe how things will pan out in, as you suggest, in the next 10 years. In one scenario, I can see us keep going more or less as we're doing. We have some regulatory interventions, kind of in the vein of GDPR or CPPA, perhaps a federal regulation, but essentially still in the vein of trying to give users some more control, some more information, and perhaps rein in some of the most offending practices by data collecting firms, but without really altering dramatically the lay of the land, without altering dramatically the landscape. In another scenario, perhaps we see more effort towards nudging intervention, be them driven by private sector or policymakers, as I was mentioning earlier. To be honest with you, although I do study nudges, I don't believe that nudges are the final solution to the privacy issue. And the problem being one of consumer responsabilization. So nudges, as well as in general notice and consent regimes, push lots of responsibility to users. The upside of that is, giving users more control, and control is great. The downside of that is responsibilizing users means also putting the burden or responsibility on them, and that's tricky because it's really difficult for any one of us to manage their privacy online, considering that our data is being collected all the time, everywhere we go. So there is a potential third scenario, which I find unlikely but possible, where for some reason we have a much more aggressive type of regulation, which sets baseline standards of protection, privacy not just by design, but privacy by default, kind of like the route Apple seems to be going, only that Apple is private sector. Imagine now regulators trying to impose that as the default. Now, this may appear absolutely crazy from a certain standpoint, because it could lead people to believe that privacy by default and by design means no more data analytics, no more big data, no more beneficial analysis of data for everyone. But that's not the case, because the secret weapon that we have are privacy-enhancing technologies and privacy-preserving algorithms. All the research on differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, federated learning is telling us that there is possibly a way to protect data while also extracting value and benefits from data. And this is, to me, the most exciting thing to look at in the next 10 years.
Well, thank you, Alessandro, for taking the time to speak with us today. This has been a great discussion and fun. Love the word nudges. And to those listening, we'll be back soon for another episode of What's Next in Cyber.
Copyright 2021 PwC. All rights reserved. PwC refers to the PwC network and/or one or more of its member firms, each of which is a separate legal entity. please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This content is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.